Right now, somewhere in your life, someone is telling you what to do. A boss, a doctor, a voice on a screen wearing a uniform, or just a badge, or just confidence. You probably think you'd say no if the request crossed a line. Most people think that. But the real answer is far stranger and far more uncomfortable than you'd like it to be. Because in 1961, a psychologist built a room, a machine, and a stranger's voice behind a wall, and he used them to ask a single question. Not whether people are evil, whether people will hurt someone else simply because a man in a lab coat told them to. The results didn't just surprise him, they terrified him, and they're still terrifying because the machine in that room wasn't really the machine at all. You are. Let's go back to where it started. New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University, a newspaper ad asking for volunteers to take part in a study about memory and learning. $40 for an hour of your time, which back then was real money. Ordinary people answered. Teachers, postal workers, engineers. Nobody famous, nobody dangerous, just people who wanted $40 and a Tuesday afternoon that felt like it mattered. They walked into a room and met two other men. One was the experimenter, stern, clipboard in hand, wearing the coat that says, "Trust me," without saying anything at all. The other was a warm, friendly man introduced as a fellow volunteer. What the real volunteer didn't know was that this second man was an actor. And the entire experiment, every single piece of it, had already been decided before they walked in the door. The setup was simple. One person would be the teacher, one would be the learner. A drawing decided who got which role, except the drawing was rigged. The real volunteer always became the teacher. The actor always became the learner, and he was led into another room and strapped visibly into a chair with an electrode fixed to his wrist. The teacher watched this happen. That detail matters more than it sounds. You don't forget the sight of someone being strapped down. It stays with you the entire time you're in that room. Then the teacher was seated in front of a machine. 30 switches in a neat row, each one a little higher voltage than the last. 15 volts, then 30, then 45, climbing all the way up to 450. Labels ran along the switches, calm and clinical at first. Slight shock, moderate shock. Then the language changed. The way rooms change temperature without anyone touching a dial. Strong shock, very strong shock, danger, severe shock. And at the very end, past even that, just 2 letters and an X, sex X. No description. As if language itself had given up trying to explain what came next. The task was easy to understand. The learner in the next room had to memorize word pairs. Every time he got one wrong, the teacher was told to deliver a shock, and every wrong answer meant a slightly higher voltage than the one before. Here's what the teacher didn't know. There was no real electricity. The learner was never in any danger. What he was doing on the other side of that wall was performing, because the true subject of the experiment wasn't the man in the chair at all. It was the person flipping the switches. You're probably already asking the question everyone asks at this point. How far would you go? Before the study even began, Stanley Milgram, the psychologist running it, asked that exact question to a group of psychiatrists. He wanted a prediction. They gave him one confidently. Only a tiny fraction of people, they said, maybe 1 in 1,000, would go all the way to the end. Only the disturbed, only the cruel. Everyone else would refuse long before the voltage climbed anywhere close to dangerous. It was, they assured him, basic human decency. People don't hurt strangers on command. They were wrong, not a little wrong, catastrophically wrong. As the experiment ran, the learner behind the wall began to react right on cue, exactly as instructed. At 75 volts, a grunt. At 120, a shout that this was starting to really hurt. At 150, something that stopped a lot of teachers cold. A voice muffled through the wall saying he wanted out. He was refusing to continue. He had a heart condition. He wanted to be let out of the room now. And here's where the actual experiment began.
Yeah.
Because the teacher, hearing this, would usually turn to the man in the lab coat and hesitate. Ask if they should stop. And the man in the lab coat, calm as ever, would say only 4 short phrases in order, whichever one was needed. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. That's it. No threats. No consequences. No one holding a door shut. just a voice staying calm, repeating a version of the same sentence, and people kept going. Not everyone, and not without a fight. Some sweated, some laughed nervously, the strange, broken laugh people make when their body doesn't know what their mind is doing. Some argued with the experimenter, hands shaking, voices rising. But 65%, almost 2 out of every 3 ordinary people who walked in off the street for $40, continued all the way to 450 volts. Past danger, severe shock. Past the point where the learner had gone completely, ominously silent, which the teacher had every reason to interpret as the worst possible outcome. 2 out of 3, not 1 in 1,000. Milgram didn't run this once. He ran variations of it for years, tweaking the conditions to understand what made obedience rise or fall, and what he found reshaped how psychology understands human behavior permanently. Distance mattered enormously. When the teacher had to physically hold the learner's hand down on a shock plate, obedience dropped sharply because now they couldn't pretend distance was doing the moral work for them. When the experimenter gave instructions by phone instead of standing in the room, obedience dropped too. Proximity to authority made people more likely to obey it. Proximity to the victim made people less likely to hurt them. Put those two facts side by side, and you start to understand something about every atrocity in history that involved paperwork, distance, and a chain of command nobody could quite point a finger at. Uniforms mattered. When the study moved from Yale's prestigious campus to a rundown office building with no university affiliation, obedience dropped, but only slightly. People didn't need Yale's name. They just needed someone who looked like they were in charge. And this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. When another actor playing a second teacher refused to continue partway through, real participants were far more likely to refuse too. Defiance was contagious. So was obedience. Neither one happened in a vacuum. You didn't decide alone. You decided in a room, shaped by whoever else was in it with you. You're probably telling yourself right now that you'd have been in the 35%. The ones who refused. Here's the uncomfortable mirror the study holds up. Everyone thinks that. The psychiatrists thought that. The volunteers themselves, when surveyed afterward, thought that right up until the moment their own hand was on the switch. Milgram wasn't testing evil people. He was testing regular people, and regular people obeyed. So why? This is where the deep dive gets interesting, because the answer isn't simply people are weak or people are bad. It's something built deeper into how your brain processes authority, and it has an evolutionary logic underneath it that's easy to miss. For most of human history, survival depended on group cohesion. A human alone on the savannah, questioning every instruction from the group's most experienced hunter or elder, wasn't showing admirable independence. They were dying slightly faster than everyone else. Groups that deferred efficiently to competent authority during a crisis, a predator sighting, a flash flood, a raid from a rival band, outlived groups that argued through every decision democratically while the threat closed in. Obedience to authority isn't a bug in human psychology. It's a feature that kept ancestral humans alive long enough to have descendants. You are quite literally descended from people who were good at following instructions from someone who seemed to know what they were doing. The psychologist Hannah Arendt, writing about a Nazi war criminal on trial in Jerusalem just 1 year before Milgram's experiment began, coined a phrase that became one of the most quoted and most misunderstood ideas in modern psychology: the banality of evil. She wasn't describing a monster. She was describing something far more disturbing, a bureaucrat, unremarkable, who insisted he was simply following orders, simply doing his job, simply one link in a very long chain. Milgram read her work. It's part of what pushed him to ask his question in the first place. Not, are there evil people, but could ordinary people be talked into doing evil things one small step at a time? That phrase, one small step at a time, is the real mechanism hiding inside the shock machine. Nobody in Milgram's lab agreed to torture a stranger. They agreed to deliver 15 volts, then 30, then 45. Each step was barely different from the one before it. There was no single moment where a reasonable person could clearly say, this is the line, I am now doing something monstrous. The line kept moving, 15 volts at a time, and by the time it mattered, The person had already said yes to 90% of the journey. This is called the foot in the door effect, and it shows up everywhere, not just in laboratories. It's how small compromises become large ones. It's how a single reasonable sounding request becomes 20 steps later, something you never would have agreed to at step one. There's a second mechanism running underneath the first, and it's called the agentic state. Milgram believed that when people submit to authority, something shifts in how they experience their own actions. They stop feeling like the author of what they're doing and start feeling like the instrument of someone else's decision. The hand is still yours. The choice psychologically no longer feels like it belongs to you. It belongs to the person giving the orders. This is why so many participants afterward described the experience the same way. They said some version of, "I was just doing what I was told," not as an excuse, as a genuine description of how it felt from the inside. You've felt a small version of this yourself, even if nothing about your life resembles a Yale laboratory. The moment at work when you followed an instruction you privately disagreed with because pushing back felt heavier than compliance. The moment you didn't ask a question because everyone else in the room seemed to already understand and you didn't want to be the one who broke the group's confidence. That's the same current running at a much lower voltage. Milgram wasn't the only one to find this. A separate line of research had already shown something eerily similar about conformity, run by a psychologist named Solomon Asch just a few years earlier. Asch put people in a room with actors and asked them to judge the length of lines on a card, an absurdly easy task. When the actors around them confidently gave the wrong answer, a third of real participants went along with it, agreeing with an answer they could plainly see was incorrect, just to avoid standing alone against the group. Asch's study was about perception. Milgram's was about action. Together they suggest something bigger than either alone. Human judgment doesn't operate in isolation. It bends toward whatever the surrounding social environment insists is true or right or necessary. And then there's a study that almost nobody outside psychology has heard of, but which might be the most directly relevant to your actual life. In 1966, a researcher named Charles Halfling ran a version of Milgram's question inside real hospitals on real nurses who had no idea they were part of an experiment. A doctor they'd never met called in by phone and instructed them to administer a drug at double the maximum safe dosage, listed right there on the label, a clear, obvious violation of hospital policy. 95% of the nurses started to do it, not because they were careless, because a voice on the phone identified itself as a doctor, and hospitals, like most institutions, run on a hierarchy where questioning the person above you carries its own social cost. Notice what's happening across all three of these studies. None of them required a villain. Milgram's shock machine, Asch's line cards, Hofling's hospital phone call, they all worked on decent, unremarkable people, and they all worked for the same underlying reason. Humans are wired to trust structure. Somebody in a coat, a badge, a title, a hierarchy that's been there longer than you have. And most of the time, that wiring serves you well. Surgeons need nurses who trust the chart. Pilots need co-pilots who trust protocol during an emergency, not co-pilots relitigating every decision mid-crisis. The wiring isn't the problem. The problem is that the same wiring that lets a hospital function can be borrowed by anyone willing to put on the coat. Here's the twist that makes this story more than just a grim historical footnote. Milgram's study has been criticized for decades, questioned, picked apart, and in some cases, ethically condemned outright because participants left that room having learned something devastating about themselves without ever consenting to learn it. But when researchers tried to replicate his findings under far stricter modern ethical guidelines, they didn't find that human nature had changed. In 2009, a psychologist named Jerry Berger ran a partial replication, stopping the experiment at a much lower, safer voltage, and found obedience rates strikingly close to Milgram's original numbers. Nearly 50 years later, in a different generation, in a different world, the $40 volunteers of 1961 and the participants of the early 21st century behaved almost identically when a calm authority figure told them to continue. That should stop you for a second, because it means this was never really about post-war Germany or a strange moment in American history or something that belonged to a darker, less enlightened past. It's still here. It's running quietly under the surface of your ordinary week. So where does it show up in your life right now today? It shows up anytime you defer, not because you were persuaded, but because questioning felt more costly than compliance. It shows up in the meeting where everyone nodded at a decision nobody actually agreed with because the first person who spoke sounded certain, and certainty travels through a room like a scent. It shows up in the customer service call you didn't push back on, the policy you followed even though it didn't make sense, the instruction you carried out from someone whose actual judgment, if you're honest, you don't fully trust. None of these are shock machines, but they run on the exact same current. A voice staying calm, saying, please continue. And it shows up in the opposite direction too, in the moments the study almost never gets remembered for. Milgram found that when even one other person in the room refused to continue, obedience collapsed. Real participants suddenly found the courage they thought they didn't have because someone else went first and proved that the room wasn't as unified as it seemed. This is the part of the story worth carrying with you. Obedience isn't a fixed trait, something you either have or don't. It's a current that runs through a room, and one person breaking that current changes what's possible for everyone standing near them. Right now, somewhere in your life, someone is telling you what to do. Most of the time, that's fine. That's how hospitals run, how planes land safely, how societies hold together instead of unraveling into constant negotiation. But somewhere in that same life, there's a moment coming, small and disguised as reasonable, where the voltage will climb by just one notch, and the only thing standing between compliance and conscience will be whether you remember that the choice, quietly, was always yours.